Good afternoon. Thank you for coming to this important symposium. My name is Mohamed Kamara. I'm a professor and the chair of the Department of African Studies in the College of Arts and Sciences here at Howard University. And it is my honor and privilege to introduce the person who is representing the Howard University leadership to this symposium and invite him to give the official welcoming remarks on behalf of the leadership. Ladies and gentlemen, join me in welcoming Professor Ruben Patterson, Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences.
Thank you, Dr. Kamara. Being told the mic has never happened. So, hello colleagues, and welcome, dear guests, to Howard University. Lovely to have you on this important topic. We're sort of on a roll now at Howard University regarding the environment. Just recently, we had a launching, an official launching of the new department, the Department of Earth, Environment, and Equity. So we're really excited about that. We started out with some concentrations in interdisciplinary studies back in 2016. We graduated some students that are going on to very good places and are doing well in environmental studies PhD programs at places like Oxford and Berkeley and UCLA and others. So we did have a concentration, and that's what we're going to do with the department, with also a lot more faculty in that particular area. My heart is really into this. Back in, one of you, our dear friend here from the State Department mentioned that there's an interest in diversifying voices in this particular field. So we're kind of kindred spirits in that regard. Back in, I don't know, back in 2015, 2016, I published a book, Reading Africana Studies, because at the time I was at a PWI campus where some 90% of black students are, in higher education. And I also worked there at that institution to help establish environmental studies. And there's just a paucity of black students taking those classes. I'm thinking like, what the heck, right? Given that there's, in terms of legacy pollution and climate change issues and effects have, black and brown faces on the front line. So why the absence? So I wrote the book really because to try to green Africana studies, because given that, but on PWI campuses, black students do take African American studies classes. So if we can actually sort of green those curriculums, then we'll have a way of introducing students to that. So anyway, that was my strategy. I have a strategy. It's going to solve the problem, right? So at a PWI campus, and then when I said, okay, I'm going to return to Howard, I have a different strategy. You got all this brilliant talent, students here at Howard, but there's no program. So why don't I just go to Howard and just start a program and get a department? Only took 9 years, but they always say that. I joke about if you ever hear that the world is going to end, go to a college campus and everything is delayed. But it took 9 years. But nonetheless, we fought the good fight, and so we're on the brink of having a new department. And I know that Howard is going to be at the forefront of producing the next generation of black intellectuals, scientists, and policy ones in the area of to address climate change and all the rest associated with that. So anyway, I just want to share some of that with you, and thank you for being here. Let's continue the partnership, let's deepen the partnership, and affect change the way in which we want it. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean Patrick.
Thank you so much. I'm going to have to adjust this for my height. Hi, everyone. It is such a pleasure to be here with you all today. My name is Gaina Davila. I am the policy coordinator for Sub-Saharan Africa at the State Department in our Bureau of OES. That's the short form for the Bureau of Oceans and International Environmental and Scientific Affairs. I want to just very quickly just thank my colleague Emma, who's here with me today. She is a public policy officer working in our office as well. And I do want to specifically thank Dr. Halou for working with me on this event today from the very beginning. So just very briefly, we have our Deputy Assistant Secretary who will be arriving just after the first panel. She'll be delivering her discourse and getting the opportunity to meet many of you here and just the great work that you are all doing. I wanted to highlight that for me, when I first thought about putting this program together through the State Department, I thought about the importance of what Secretary Blinken has over and over mentioned in terms of foreign affairs and the importance of diversifying the voices that are at the table who are shaping foreign affairs both domestically in the United States and abroad at our embassies. And so to me, it made a lot of sense to connect with Howard to try to build today's symposium. And so I just want to quickly note here, I read that Howard prepares diverse, talented, and ambitious students to learn, lead, and embody excellence in truth and service. That is indeed what we're looking for at the State Department, and so it gives me quite a lot of joy to see the young leaders in this room, the young faces here who are excited and ready to be at the forefront of this. And so without further ado, I am looking forward to the symposium. I'm looking forward to hearing just all the great work that our panelists here are doing. And with that, I will pass it on to Dr. Kara, who's going to be our moderator for today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Again, thank you, and I'm glad to be the moderator of this first panel. And I'm going to ask the panelists to introduce themselves once they start their own presentation, but very quickly I'm just going to identify them for the audience. Well, of course, they are all to my left, so I'm going to begin with Dr. Anita Plummer, and then Dr. Floyd Bugarin, and Dr. Willow Winstead, and Dr. Ian Valhi, right? Valhi, yes. Okay, I'm sorry. I lost my glasses. Oh my God. No, I don't wear it. So I'm going to, without further ado, I'm going to ask Dr. Bugarin, who is first on the list, to give us her presentation. I have been instructed to make sure that we don't go beyond 10 minutes maximum. Anywhere you want. If you want to go to the podium, that would be fine.
Try to keep this to 10 minutes, we'll see. I just want to thank everybody for organizing this symposium and delivering my talk on West Africa. The title of my talk is The Impacts of Global Warming on the Coastal Areas of West Africa. I'll look at the effects of flooding, drought, and extreme weather patterns in the region. In West Africa, global warming impacts the coastal regions of some of the poorest countries in the world in profound and intractable ways. In fact, the United Nations has identified West Africa as a climate change hotspot. We have witnessed three main impacts. One, rising sea levels, flooding, and increased rainfall. Two, drought and water scarcity. And three, extreme and unpredictable temperature fluctuations and weather patterns. These changes in climate and environmental conditions, in turn, have led to severe impacts on people, biodiversity, and the social and natural environment. Climate change threatens livelihoods, built environments, infrastructure, archaeological and heritage sites, historical artifacts, sacred and cultural sites, including something that's seldom mentioned, but graveyards and other human burials that may be disturbed, break through the topsoil, and thus will eventually in the near future need to be relocated. Erratic rainfall, flooding, and cycles and timing of extreme rainfall coupled with prolonged drought cause social degradation, erosion, and changes in soil chemistry. The survival and sustainability of the people in this region, who depend largely on agriculture agriculture and fishing subsistence patterns are under threat. Data shows that there is also correlation between global warming and higher levels of poverty. Scholars also point out that climate change impacts human health. Warmer temperatures and increased precipitation are ideal conditions for the spread of viruses, bacteria, and parasites, including diseases such as malaria and dengue fever, diseases that already pose significant problems in these areas. It is also likely to affect girls and women's health, reproduction, and well-being through impacts on education and gender-specific livelihoods and tasks. Scholars have highlighted the relationship of climate change to increased violence and conflict due to stresses placed on limited resources. Global warming spurs on disputes between pastoralists and farmers over land rights. For pastoralists, extreme weather patterns will impact access to grazing lands, the availability of watering holes, and migratory patterns. And for farmers, climate change can reduce crop yields. People throughout the shoreline areas of West Africa thus face increasing rates of food insecurity, hunger, and poverty. Lastly, I want to point out that climate change impacts heritage sites, landscapes, and tourism. Some significant cultural and historical sites, those listed on the UNESCO World Heritage List, are in danger of disappearing or have already faced devastating destruction. Several of these, as well as others, draw in tourists from around the world on a regular basis. They are the basis for informal and formal jobs and a major source of income for several countries. They also may hold cultural meaning and political or religious significance. A recent study on African heritage sites threatened by the rise of sea level, Vuzdauskas and his co-partners studied 213 natural and 71 cultural African World Heritage sites to assess the impacts of flooding and erosion. They observed that multiple sites, including UNESCO World Heritage sites, reside in low-lying seaside territories and thus are vulnerable to coastal hazards relating to rising sea levels. They found that 56 sites, or 20%, are at risk from a once-in-a-century coastal extreme event. And by 2050, they predict that a number of exposed sites is predicted to more than triple. Overall, climate change is leading to significant transformations in West Africa that threaten the security and sustainability of the region. Climate change has led to and will continue to lead to severe consequences for the environment, biodiversity, economies, politics, societies, and cultures. So to take a closer look and offer you an example, I decided to focus on Senegal and the Gambia, where I work. Senegal and the Gambia are both least developed countries, also located in the Sahel region. They are illustrative of the impacts of climate change on coastal regions in West Africa. They face significant structural challenges to sustainable development. Projections show that the Western Sahel region will experience the strongest drying with a significant increase in the maximum length of dry spells due to climate change. Throughout the Sahel, in fact, temperatures are rising 1.5 times faster than the global average. And countries in this region could be 3 to 5 degrees Celsius warmer by 2050. Climate change impacts the Gambia and Senegal in several ways. They have faced rapidly increasing temperatures, more frequent heat waves, more severe droughts and floods, more storms, and exacerbated water scarcity problems. Both countries have experienced longer dry periods and shorter, more intense rainy periods. Also, both countries have low-lying shoreline areas that are hit hard by rising sea levels. They face coastal erosion, saltwater intrusion into freshwater resources, and the destruction of arable land. All these impacts have led to crop failures, loss and damage of property, and the displacement of people. Additionally, they have resulted in detrimental effects on biodiversity, such as the decline in specific tree and shrub species, alterations in habitats, and the diminishing of animal populations dependent upon these resources. Both are home to national parks and wildlife preserves, that have faced a loss of vegetation and a decline of animal populations. As seasons become less predictable, the migratory patterns of birds are disrupted, and the warmer temperatures and changing currents have impacted sea turtles, who are struggling to maintain traditional nesting habits. Changes in the water flow and temperatures also impact fish populations. These changes in turn have affected the food supply, medicines, and tourism. Both countries rely on international tourists who visit their beaches on a yearly cycle and heritage sites. Specifically in the Gambia, approximately 80% of the population depends on agriculture for their basic food needs and cash income. For many rural families, most who fall below the poverty line, a farming economy is their only means of income. Urban dwellers also face challenges. Those that live in the capital city of Banjul, specifically in the Tobacco Road neighborhood, suffer from flooding of a polluted, stagnant canal. When it downpours, the canal overflows and sends polluted water to the local impoverished and informal settlements, including raw sewage dumped from local pipes. Compounding the situations, citizens have noticed that crocodiles have been wandering into their neighborhoods. The Gambia is also home to Kinte Island, a UNESCO World Heritage Site well known due to the research of Alex Haley for the root story and its importance in the transatlantic slave trade. This is where students and I have done archaeological investigations. Although efforts have been made to repair the structures on the island, rising tides, storms, high temperatures, and extreme fluctuations in the climate continuously contribute to the erosion of the island's fort, the island itself, and the artifacts. The site is important to not just Gambians, it's a pilgrimage destination for people of African descent, and it is visited by many people around the world. For some, it's the only means of income in the local communities. Another example of the impacts of climate change on coastal sites can be seen in Senegal, home to Gorée Island in St. Louis, otherwise known as the Venice of Africa. Both sites are designated as UNESCO World Heritage Sites. Gorée Island is known for being a key site in the transatlantic slave trade, and St. Louis is known for its colonial-style architecture and once being the capital of Senegal. Gorée Island is faced with threats due to continuous shoreline erosion, a problem that also impacts tourism and the country's beaches. On Gorée Island, the house that held enslaved people, the mosque, school, and museum are the most affected by erosion, according to a study done by Back Home in Njora. In St. Louis, fishing makes up 90% of the economy. Due to climate change, the city has seen rising sea levels, flooding, and storm surges, and its northern coastal region is quickly sinking. These impacts have led to the collapse of some fishing businesses, destruction of property, displacement of families, and the creation of climate refugees. In 2018, they implemented the Senegal Emergency Recovery and Resilience Project, a project devoted to helping the city reduce their vulnerability. Yet despite several millions devoted to that project, some residents refuse to leave and remain in the area and remain vulnerable to coastal threats. While many are concerned about the threats to shoreline areas in West Africa and share concerns about climate change, some have made steps to address the challenges and threats. People in the Gambia and Senegal have taken initiative to mitigate destruction and adapt to the impacts. In terms of conservation and preservation of natural and cultural resources, people are fortifying buildings, using protective barriers, and investing in better management strategies. In conclusion, in terms of subsistence strategies, we are striving for climate-resilient agriculture, improved water management, and increased use of renewable energy sources. Some have implemented optimal farming strategies, including improving irrigation infrastructure, trying drought-resistant and other appropriate seeds, and using different types of fertilizers. Overall, while people in the coastal regions of West Africa, along with their partners, are taking steps to mitigate all different types of damage and all different types of threats caused by climate change, there is still much work that can be done to ensure the sustainability and safety of the people in those regions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Bugarin, for this brilliant presentation and also for being within the time limit. At this point, I would like to invite Dr. Willow Winstead of the Center for African Studies for his presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Kumar. I'm going to see if I can hook up my laptop here. This work. All right. Good morning, everyone. I guess this afternoon. Thank you, Dr. Hailu, for the opportunity to do this little presentation. My name is Wheeler Winstead. I am the Assistant Director for the Center for African Studies here at Howard University. And my presentation is going to be on global epicenters of illegal fishing, appraising the promise and fragility of the land and coastal marine ecosystem of Africa. And the way I want to approach this, I want to look first at just defining what is illegal fishing, how big is it, why is it important to us meaning those of us here in the United States, and in Africa, who are the actors and how it can be remedied. So why address illegal fishing? Because according to the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, illegal fishing is one of the greatest threats to marine ecology. And that's not just to African marine ecology, but to marine ecology. So I thought we can first start by this, at least understanding what do we mean by illegal fishing. And the FOA, often when they speak of illegal fishing, they just simply use the initials IUU, and that stands for illegal fishing related to vessels and waters under the jurisdiction of a state without the permission of that state or in contravention of its laws, or unreported fishing refers to fishing that has not been reported at all or misrepresented, misreported either to national authorities or to regional authorities or local authorities, or unregulated fishing, which corresponds to areas of or for fishing stock in relationship to which there are no applicable conservation or management measures. So if you see the term IUU, it's referring to illegal, unreported, and unregulated. So how big is this? Well, according to a number of statistics, up to 26 million tons per year of illegal fishing happens, and it earns up to $23 billion. Off West Africa, it's estimated that 40% of all fish caught off the coast of West Africa is IUU, or illegal, unregulated, unreported fishing. And that's around $1.3 billion every year. Another statistic I thought was quite interesting, since I like wild-caught fish, that it suggests that 1/3 of the wild-caught seafood imported into the U.S. comes from IUU. 1/3 of all that great fish that you and I like to eat, because it's wild-caught, it's IUU, or illegal fishing. So why is this important to us and to Africa? First, it undermines the national and regional efforts to manage fisheries and sustainability, and it endeavors to conserve marine diversity. It squeezes, blocks out the livelihood of those small scale fishermen, that goes to exacerbate poverty and augment food insecurity. It's a serious violation of fishermen's human rights. Often occur, if you read any of the stories or do any research on it, one of the things you'll start to see are these stories of fishermen who are made to work 20 hours, sometimes all day long, on these boats that are carrying out this illegal fishing. And there are other abuses that happen. It accelerates stock depletion, and it undermines protection and recovery methods. So these are just some of the reasons why it's important to us and why it's important to Africa. So how does this operate? Why is this able to exist? Well, the primary reason IUU fishing is able to operate because it takes advantage of corrupt administration, or it exploits weak management regimes, particularly those in developing countries like those off the coast of Africa, that lack the capacity and resources to effectively monitor, control, or have surveillance. And it sometimes and often is associated with organized crime. So this is how it operates. So let's look at it in terms of Africa. Why is it important to Africa? Well, if you are anyone that studied the economy of Africa and have looked at what they refer to as the blue economy, there are reports, and I believe those, and these are pretty strong reports. It shows that the coastal waters of West Africa contain some of the world's richest fishing grounds. By the way, that's not unlike the land in Africa, which also contains some of the great minerals of the world. But right off the coast, the fishing is some of the world's richest fishing grounds. And it is one of the 7 crucial areas for creating sustainable blue economies. And it is one of those relatively untapped sectors in African development and prosperity. And this is according to the 2019 Africa Blue Economy Strategy. So it has great promise for Africa, but it's also very fragile because of IUU. IUU undermines the emerging blue economy initiatives across the coast. You heard Dr. Bugarin talk about, I believe it was Senegal you were mentioning, and that in the countries of Mauritania, Senegal, the Gambia, Guinea-Bissau, Guinea, and Sierra Leone alone, the loss is estimated at $2.3 billion. And if you look at these struggling countries, if this were added to their coffers, this is what they are losing. And illegal fishing takes many forms, but it's that large-scale industrial fishing that does the most damage to the ecosystem and the environment. Illegal fishing erodes community trust in law and enforcement, and it creates a sense of lawlessness and neglect. And this is one of the things that was particularly interesting to me, because it points out that it creates an environment which organized crime thrives. And together with the loss of livelihood, this can fuel local level violence and criminality. And it gave a really clear example of that. Some of you might be familiar with the movie Captain Phillip. Well, this was a movie, a true story about a 2009 takeover of an American vessel by local Somalian pirates. And this was because of that illegal environment that was happening in their waters, that it led some of them to take arms and to attack the American vessel. So in terms of IUU in Africa, it is important that there is transparency. One of the problems is, and this was the study they looked at, where 8 of the 10 fishing vessels that were examined were Chinese, and there was this fluidity of ownership where one vessel may 1 year fish under one flag and then they change and fish under another flag to change the identity. And why does this flourish? It flourishes because it's profitable. These are some other things that points to it. There are larger capacity fishing vessels. They can catch more fish. It's unregulated, ineffective enforcement, tax havens that really distort the whole scenario. And there is a false estimation of how big the fishing stocks are. So if you estimate that there's more fish there, then you can actually catch more fish than really there is, and you really are depleting the stock. So finally, let me just do this quickly. I was given 2 minutes. So who are the actors? United States, Europe, and Japan. We consume 55% of the world's fish. And as I mentioned, 1/3 of the boycott they believe, come from IUU vessels. And Chinese vessels, what they often do will catch it, and then they'll sell it to other vessels or other companies that are legitimate. Let me just move to what are some solutions? Global cooperation. Both the AU and the United States are now putting in regulations, basically that's requiring that imported fish get some sort of certificate from the government of the exporting country saying that it's legitimate. AU has done that. The United States has done that. President Biden has signed a memorandum encouraging and increasing the number of fish that are included in the original restriction or regulation. Japan has done it. So finally, solutions for Africa. They've got to allocate resources to monitor and control their vessels. I think in most of the articles it talks about the importance of cooperating with the international community, but honestly, in my opinion, it comes down to if African countries are going to want to control African resources, then they themselves must allocate the resources to monitor and control their environment. And I thought a great solution was dealing with or interjecting ECOWAS, which is a regional authority that could actually do what many small countries can't do, and to employ ECOWAS in that effort of the whole issue of the Western coast, particularly monitoring and controlling the environment. And lastly, joint efforts that are already established on the international market. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Winstead, for this detailed presentation on excessive fisheries and with solid data. Now I'm going to invite Dr. Anita Plummer to present on harnessing the blue economy, Chinese finance meets environmental justice in Kenya's coastline infrastructures. Plummer.
I think we can all agree, since both of my co-panelists were on time, that I get to run over about 5 or 6 minutes. Okay, I've seriously cut out entire pages of my talk, so please grant me some grace here. Okay, so good, tech is working. Is that okay? So I want to thank Dr. Hailu and the organizing committee for this symposium. Happy Open Week, everyone. Today I want to share some of my research on the LAPSET corridor. It's a large, multi-country infrastructure program and its intersections with Kenya's Blue Economy Framework and various efforts at promoting environmental sustainability. I will begin by discussing the Blue Economy approach, which Dr. Winstead has mentioned. I'm going to define it a little bit. I've cut out the section that looks at the Blue Economy approach within larger continental plans that focus on oceans, coasts, and marine industries. But for the second part, I'll examine the impact of a large-scale port on Manda Bay and Lamu, that's in Kenya, on local fishing communities. And finally, I'll analyze how local community groups are pressuring the Kenyan government to take a bottom-up approach to development planning that promotes both sustainability, conservation, and environmental management. I argue that various community forces are holding government actors accountable, and these community-level articulations of sustainability are progressively advancing Kenya's Blue Economy Framework in a way that does not compromise the environment or development. Usually it's framed as either or, and that doesn't necessarily have to be the case. So the Blue Economy approach originated after the former president, Kenyatta, convened a task force in 2017 to examine how the country can sustainably harness the economic potential of marine resources along Kenya's coast and in its freshwater lakes. The Blue Economy Blueprint includes a wide range of economic sectors such as fisheries and aquaculture, maritime transport, tourism, environmental conservation, mining, and energy. Conceptually, it focuses on the ocean, coast, and marine industries as integral sites of both economic development and environmental sustainability. Spatially, it posits that the ocean and its coast can be harnessed as new engines of growth that will generate new trade circuits, employment, and industrial growth around the organizing principle of integrating socioeconomic development with sound environmental management and preservation. It consists of governmental policies that focus on innovative technologies, the promotion of local entrepreneurs, and local community access to capital, markets, and infrastructure. And it promotes the idea that these development spaces can provide an opportunity to practice sustainability and social capital building along with economic growth. Again, this is the policy framework that the Kenyan government has established. It aims to achieve environmental sustainability in marine planning by aligning economic and trade activities with appropriate ecological and environmental conservation and sustainability practices. So all of this is coming from the continent. It's not coming from outside actors. So all of the pages I skipped, I want some credit here. Kenya began signaling its commitment to the Blue Economy approach both internationally and domestically. Kenya, Japan, and Canada hosted the first Sustainable Blue Economy Conference in Nairobi in November 2018. At the conference, Kenyatta pledged to build institutional governance to coordinate the management of a blue economy in Kenya with the goal of creating jobs, food security, sustainable fishing, safety and security on high seas, better shipping facilities, and educational opportunities for Kenyan seafarers. Local trade publications and local media outlets in Kenya covered the discussion of Kenya's blue economy. Many people on social media tweeted about it. At this conference, representatives from the United Nations, again, Kenya, Canada, came together. There were multiple speeches on the topic. So this idea of the blue economy has hit the discourse, not only on the national scale, but you have local entrepreneurs talking about it. And of course, there are activists talking about this too. It's clear that industrialization in Kenya includes harnessing and leveraging the blue economy. This is a bridge we haven't seen before. Usually when we think of industrialization, we don't think of coastal ecologies and coastal industries. But the government is purposefully linking these two. Why? Because Kenya and other coastal countries need to exploit its own ocean and freshwater resources and improve maritime transport and logistics. So now I'm going to shift over to transport infrastructure, which also includes energy. I'm not going to talk about that, but maybe during the Q&A we can talk about how the energy sector also fits into this conversation. So in March 2012, President Kibaki hosted the presidents of Ethiopia and South Sudan in Lamu County to lay the foundation stone for the LAPSET corridor. The LAPSET corridor, a large-scale multi-country plan with an estimated 70 projects in total, was launched by the governments of Kenya, South Sudan, and Ethiopia. The $24.7 billion project, most of which will be located in Kenya. I don't have time to explain everything on the slides, but this is a map of some of the transport infrastructure, has been billed as the cornerstone for regional integration of 160 million people in the 3 host nations. The LAPSET corridor would connect with existing transport and communications infrastructure by the way of a standard gauge railway, roads, an airport, and fiber optic cables. The project includes 7 mega projects. This is how they're framing it. A 32-berth port at Manda Bay, which I'll talk about later, 4 interstate highways that will connect cities in Kenya, South Sudan, and Ethiopia, a crude oil pipeline, a refined oil pipeline, railways that connect Lamu, Isiolo, Addis, and Nairobi, airports in Lamu, Isiolo, and Lake Turkana, resort cities in Lamu, Isiolo, and Lake Turkana, and a dam along the Tana River. However, in 2018, the Kenyan High Court ruled that the process of designing and implementing the LAPSET project violated existing Kenyan environmental and constitutional law by not properly consulting the local government or considering how this project would impact environmental, social, and the cultural lives of the local community. So construction proceeded despite this, but there's light at the end of the story. So I did field research in 2019, so some of these photos, I'm not a photographer, I had a cheap phone I bought on Amazon that I took these photos with, so please forgive me. But construction of the port project started in 2013, the China Communications Construction Company. Here's some of their signage here. They're a huge company that carries out infrastructural projects globally, not just in China. They're one of the largest. They were granted the $484 million contract to build the first 3 berths of the port located in Manda Bay. Here, you have to take a boat up to the shore. The dock has the signage. There's a map here of what this project, this vast project, is going to look like. And here it is. 3 berths have been completed, but the entire project includes 32 deep water berths as part of this port. It's massive. It'll be 3 times larger than the port to its south, Mombasa Bay, the Mombasa port. Now, it's estimated that this new port will be able to process 28 million tons of cargo annually. And clearly, the government is arguing that there's a demand because the Mombasa port to the south had already underwent a massive expansion. So there were questions in terms of whether or not the demand was there. Yes, market studies said there was a demand. The Kenyan Ports Authority said one of the arguments for building this port was that there was too much competition from the port in Dar es Salaam. And there was pressure to realize this large-scale project. So, of course, I only have 2 minutes left. Let me just let you know what local residents were saying. One, the immediate environmental and economic impacts of the port were evident in terms of the physical changes. So, this should be on mute. I'm going to talk. I want you to look at the mangrove forests that exist on the way to the port. Let's see if this works. Okay, I can't get this to play. All right. So immediately, the dredging of the Manda Bay and the Mukanda Channel, which is the channel that this video shows me traveling through. The excavation included coral and sediments from the ocean floor that was dredged up. So that means fishing areas that fishers went and used on a daily basis were no longer fishable because the fish had migrated. So mangrove trees were cleared for the construction of the port facilities. The seagrasses, the turtle nesting areas were also completely devastated. So imagine this area covered previously by mangrove forests that were occupied by indigenous communities and were used for foraging, tourism. So it was an economic lifeline for the residents. Fast forward, activists began protesting what they saw was happening. And there was a court case that ruled in their favor. The court case was one because there was not an environmental impact study. So the compensation for the Aware community that lived there was they were compensated for land. However, speculators that didn't have deeds to the land went in, claimed the land. So there was land grabbing happening. So even with the court case, people didn't feel good after the construction had started. In the same area, so this is in 2019 when I went, what it looked like. This is what it looks like today. It's completely been built out. All of those mangrove forests, all those fishing areas have been destroyed, and fishers who I interviewed, they asked, will we have access to these fishing waters? And they've been in negotiations with the government, and because of security reasons, they won't, because of Al-Shabaab and different security risks in this area. So, interestingly enough, a lot of the community members I interviewed said, we're not opposed to development. We just want to be a part of the developmental processes. They said, yes, we want Kenya's economy to expand, but are we even getting jobs on these construction sites? And they weren't. They weren't even, and they know because it's pretty accessible, but they could tell by people's accents, the construction workers, that they weren't from the Swahili coast. So they said, we're not even being hired. We don't know anyone who's been hired to even carry out these projects. So the community has been very active in opposing different parts of this project. Some areas they have been successful. But what's interesting is they're using legal frameworks that are already in place. There are very progressive laws on the books within Kenya that account for sustainability, conservation, and management. So it's not as if they're starting from nowhere. And I think what this tells us is that bottom-up development processes in which community members hold governments accountable can make progressive change, and it can lead to true sustainability and development. If you want to read the paper, I'll send it to you. Thank you so much for letting me go over. My apologies.
Thank you. Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Plummer. And now I would like to invite Dr. Ian Rahi, CEO of IR Symposium. I hope I'm saying it correctly. Okay. And his topic is a candid examination of the fisheries enforcement challenges in sub-Saharan Africa.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to Howard University and to the State Department for the opportunity to be here. I'm actually really excited to be back on this campus. I haven't been here since I was on the swimming and diving team at UMBC more than 2 decades ago, so it's a real pleasure to be back here, and it looks very different. So I'm excited to get to meet everyone today and to share some of my experiences working on these issues. So I'm a little bit of an anomaly in that I am not an academic per se. I have been working around the world on maritime law and security issues for the last 20 years, and I have often glibly explained my job as being that I fight pirates, traffickers, smugglers, and thieves. In that context, a lot of my work has ended up focusing on countering illegal, unreported, unregulated fishing, fisheries crime, and other aspects relating to the fishing sector. And so over the last several decades, I have had a really amazing opportunity to build relationships with some of the professionals in Africa who are charged with the responsibility of enforcing fisheries laws and regulations. That includes both the fisheries ministries as well as the navies and coast guards of the region. And so what I wanted to do was share some of the candid perspectives from the eyes of the people that I speak with daily, that I've had at my house, whose houses I've visited over the years, to understand the real challenge, not the theoretical challenge, but the day-to-day existence of what they confront trying to counter these threats that everybody now agrees are not only undermining the blue economy, but are diminishing food security and food sovereignty for the entirety of the African continent. And so I want to highlight 7 different challenges, mention 2 trends, and if there's any time left, give just 3 quick suggestions. So challenge number 1, political interference. A few years back, I called a friend of mine. I had known him for almost 20 years. For his safety, I will obscure both his real name and the name of the country. But Vincent was a very, very competent fisheries manager. And I called him and I said, hey, how are things going? I wanted to just catch up, see what's going on. He goes, oh, I guess you haven't heard. I said, haven't heard what? He goes, I found myself in a really unfortunate situation. I arrested 2 vessels for IUU fishing. And when they came back to port, I was confronted by a representative of the presidency. And I was told I had a choice. I could either go to jail or I could quit my job. I had just arrested 2 vessels, one owned by the First Lady of the country and one owned by the Chief Minister. Political interference is real, and it is really undermining the ability of professionals to do their job. The second is interagency interference, because while political leadership may interfere, so too can other agencies, sometimes the ones charged with being part of the solution. So I'll tell you another story, and again, obscure the name and the country, but I was sitting having local lobster with a friend of mine in Maxwell. He had been the former head of the Navy of this country. And he told me, in his new role, of a challenge that he'd encountered just recently. And he said, I planned an operation after we started using a maritime domain awareness platform to recognize just how many fishing vessels were operating illegally in our country. And we decided that we would go on a mission with the Navy to try to arrest as many of them in one day as we could. And the night before the mission, we notified all the other agencies that were relevant, fisheries, ports, maritime administration. And when we got up the next morning, got out early, we got out to where we expected to find all these vessels, and lo and behold, there was not a single fishing vessel in the entire country's exclusive economic zone. They'd all left overnight. And we realized what had happened. And so a month later, we planned the same mission again, and this time told no one. And we went out and we arrested 7 vessels. And we tried to hand them over to fisheries, having successfully interdicted 7 vessels for illegal fishing. And they refused to take them. They came up with some kind of excuse, and they made it very clear that they indeed were the ministry who had prevented the initial operation from having gone forward successfully in the first place. So interagency interference is a real challenge. So too is international interference. Again, obscuring the name and the country, a friend of mine told me a story of how he went out not to counter IUU fishing, but actually just on marine safety, to arrest 2 vessels that were clearly unsafe, fishing in their waters. By the time the vessels came back, his boss was waiting for him at the pier, standing next to the ambassador from the People's Republic of China. His boss, the minister, said, "What are you doing arresting these vessels? Don't you know how much they're giving to our ports, our airport, our ministerial building, and other things?" And he said, "Yes, but let me show you the vessels." And as soon as the minister saw just how unsafe the vessels were, the ambassador did have to relent and say, "Okay, maybe this time we'll let you go." The regular stories I hear of international interference from ambassadors, from ministers, from diplomats, indicates just how aggressively some states are using their diplomatic apparatus to protect illegal fishing in the waters of West and Central Africa, as well as the rest of the continent. Another challenge is lack of sustainment. Again, I called a friend a few years back, and this time I'll say the country. It was in Ghana, and I said to him, "How are things going?" And after a few minutes, he actually broke into tears. I'd known him for 20 years, and he said, "I'll tell you, over the last 20 years, we have tried so many things. And we finally had a project that was going so well. We were putting technology on the tuna vessels that were helping make sure the observers were safe so that nobody could kill the observers, so that we could make sure we could document where the vessels were at all times, and it was going so incredibly well. And then the project gets scrapped because nobody had provided for funds to maintain it. And so the first time in my career, I felt like I was finally getting somewhere, finally doing something, finally having an impact. It just ran out. So lack of sustainment is another critical challenge. Lack of physical capacity I will skip over because I think we can all understand how difficult it is to arrest a vessel for IUU fishing when you can't get out to sea. When you don't have a vessel, when you don't have the fuel, when you don't have the human capacity to actually crew the vessel, and when you don't even have the maritime domain awareness technology to monitor what is going on. And so lack of physical capacity is an ongoing challenge. But there are other lacks of capacity that are equally challenging. And I'll tell you of one situation in which a head of a Coast Guard of a Central African state was talking to me about all the problems that they were having, all the challenges that they faced, and he said, "You know, we really, really need help." And I said, "Okay, if money were no object, you could have anything you wanted that would help you do your job, what would it be?" And his response was, "A lawyer." I was like, "Look, I appreciate it. I'm a lawyer. You're trying to flatter me. It's really kind of you. But really, what would you like?" He goes, no, a lawyer. Because we are a law enforcement agency. We do not have a single lawyer who can tell us what the law says. We have the boats. We have the people. We have the training. But every time we go out, use those boats, use the people, use the training, and arrest somebody for what we think is a crime, some international lawyer comes in here and tells us we've made a mistake. And we end up paying for it. And so we don't have the legal wherewithal to make sure that the law we're trying to enforce is the right law and that we're doing it correctly. So legal capacity is a critical piece of this puzzle. And finally, lack of trust. And this I could tell you stories about all day long, but I'll switch to East Africa and tell you that when I was talking to the regional centers in East Africa about sharing information, it came to a very interesting reality in that the European Union had invested a lot of money into what they call the IORIS platform, the Indian Ocean Regional Information Sharing Platform, IORIS. And while that platform is being used, unfortunately, the platform is not being used nearly as much or for as many critical issues as was originally hoped and intended. And I asked why, and the answer I got was quite candid. The answer was because when it comes to IUU fishing, France and Spain are a bigger problem than China. That was the perspective. That was the perception. France and Spain were bigger problems than China. In fact, it went so far as to say that the operational lead and the intelligence lead for Operation Atalanta, the European Union's naval force mission to counter piracy off the coast of Somalia, switched after Brexit from the UK to split between France and Spain. And everyone in the region will tell you that the reason that France and Spain wanted those roles was to protect their IUU fishing fleet. Which brings me to two trends I want to just mention quickly. The first is state-protected illicit fishing. Now, China has done this in incredible ways, and I could tell you about how they actually physically use their Coast Guard to protect against other interference. Iran's done this in interesting ways, where they use silence to prevent anyone from even recognizing that this is truly attached to the state. Vietnam has done this in literally breaking diplomatic ties with states over vessel arrests. But I want to actually highlight the EU, because in 2013, this data is old because it was from a project I did then. Things have changed a little bit, but not much, and it kind of makes it nicer to share. So in 2013, so a long time ago, the EU had a fisheries partnership agreement with Sao Tome and Principe. That fisheries partnership agreement allowed for 40 vessels to fish for up to 7,000 tons apiece for the year. And those 40 vessels were given that block license for a total payment to Sao Tome of 685,000 euros. The problem was that at any given time, the fishing vessels on the water indicated that there were at least 55 EU flag fishing vessels fishing. Now, if anybody has a guess, I'd love to hear it as to how many fish the EU vessels claim to have caught over that time, but I'll fast forward and just let you know it was 0. Over 10 years, they caught no fish. So they're paying a license fee. They're fishing all year round with more vessels than they're allowed to fish, or allowed to use. And they're not catching any fish according to the records. Unfortunately, if they had actually just fished to quota and reported that fish catch and paid tax on it as they were supposed to, it would have accrued 55 million euros a year for Sao Tome, a country whose GDP at the time was $250 million. That is the kind of lack of trust and trend that we're up against. So when we start pointing the finger at China, we have to be rigorous in doing so, because we need to recognize that China is by no means the only offender in this space. But China does something different, and this is the other trend. And I'll finish here, and hopefully we can add the suggestions in the Q&A session, because I hate ending on a really negative note. But China is not just interested in fish. China's distant water fleet has been operating how we can use the convening authorities that we have better, and how we can redefine maritime security. But in light of time, I will stop there. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Ravi, and for this very insightful presentation. So, I mean, okay. My topic is international exploitation of resources, coastal ecologies, and sustainable development, international laws, realities, and policy directions. My predecessors have given very insightful looks into different aspects of these international exploitation initiatives and activities. I'm going to focus on a number of those and others that have not been mentioned because it's not part of their topics. First, I'm going to try to establish a quick connection between the excessive international fisheries and another very dangerous activity which hopefully has been stopped, that is toxic waste dumping. Back in the late 80s, early 90s, there was an investigation in West Africa, particularly in Guinea and Sierra Leone and Liberia, of a number of ships coming from the West. That's how it was said. No individual countries were named, but investigations revealed who those countries were. But the most deceptive aspect of this is that those ships were coming under the guise of fisheries. They were fishing ships and were allowed into the territorial waters of these countries in using that same thing to dump toxic waste on certain small islands that they are part of my country, Guinea, but they are also between Guinea and Sierra Leone. And when you dump things in the waters, it doesn't know limitations or national boundaries, particularly in the sea. And the Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS, that Dr. Winstead mentioned, the Regional Economic Community of West Africa, did reach out to then the OAU, Organization of African Unity, that forwarded the whole complaint to the United Nations, and there was a realization that this had been going on for a while, and that there was dumping of toxic waste, not only in sea, but also in land, including, as the investigators said, including in countries like Namibia and elsewhere. So that connection is there. The other aspect of international exploitation of resources is deforestation through massive irregulated mining and also illegal logging, industrial logging. And this, I agree totally with Dr. Rolby that when we point the finger at China or Russia, we better be very consistent, because China and Russia might be the white elephant in the room, but there are a lot of non-white elephants there, beginning with Iran, America, well, individual European countries, because in these cases, they're not coming as the European Union. They're coming as countries that are former colonizers to re-establish the quote-unquote historical ties. So when France comes to the coastal lines of Senegal, as Dr. Bougarin mentioned, they say, well, this is France, it's, we are the same. And when Portugal comes to Guinea-Bissau or Cape Verde, it's not like going to Ghana or Nigeria, where they are totally foreigners, strangers. And when Britain goes to Ghana or Nigeria, it's not like going to Senegal or Guinea-Bissau. So you see the trend there. Polluting mining. That China has been recently very much identified more than anybody else, whether it's in Malawi and other places. They have been, in my own country in Guinea, where China is getting really involved in the mining of bauxite, of gold, and things like that. You have entire villages that are being, moved, displaced. And when I say displaced, it's not like there is an organizational thing to come and say, okay, we're going to build a village somewhere there and move you there in an organized way. They are just being pushed. So mining is polluting the rivers and destroying the land and just leaving holes and mountains of dirt, to the point that maternal and infantile mortality in some of these regions have risen. And what is vexing is that it's the same regions where France, the United States, and the Soviet Union had been mining bauxite since the 1960s. And during that whole period, we did not experience that. In the last 15 to 20 years, that whole thing is now an open secret, or should I say an open book, because it's right there. So the displacement of populations and the deforestation also has been bringing closer to human beings animals, birds, and insects that had been carrying a lot of viruses that the humans have not caught, because the forest had shielded humans. And when Ebola began in my own country, the child or patient 0 was identified as having playing with bats. It doesn't make sense because in that particular community, southeastern Guinea, people do eat bats. So if that was the case, if it was the regular bats, these people would have been dead long time ago. But it turns out it's the deforestation. The Mount Nimba, the highest mountain in West Africa, which is a UNESCO World Heritage place, the Chinese have found a way to not exactly do deforestation, but to bring that whole area into a very vulnerable position when everything around it is under deforestation. So all of that is undermining sustainable development. In what ways? Beyond the material, tangible things, destroying arable land, water, and so on. It is undermining human security. And human security involves health security, involves food security, involves water and environmental security, communal and cultural security. When people can no longer, even with the limited self-sufficiency in food, even when they can't reach that limited self-sufficiency, they become completely dependent on imported food. Much of it is not really nutritional. We can see why there is a high rise in obesity, in diabetes, in high blood pressure in many African countries, particularly the region I know the best in West Africa. And water and environmental security goes like that because, when you don't know, it's not everybody that has, this, you don't just go and say, okay, I want this kind of water or that kind of water. I'm going to buy this, I'm going to buy that. Because sometimes you don't have internal plumbing and water is not coming in there. You go to a certain place to draw the water and so on. And you don't know what you're drinking. You don't know what you're washing your dishes, your children with. That is very dangerous. And communal and cultural security, when there is displacement, that brings communities against one another. Take take Nigeria, but also take Burkina Faso, take Mali. You see conflicts, violent conflicts, exploding between cattle herders, for example, and agriculturists. They rely on the same land, and with environmental change, with all this degradation, land becomes very scarce. People who need acres and acres of grass to sustain their cattle herds will have to trespass on other people's farms. And all of a sudden, it turns into an inter-ethnic violence, whereas ethnicity has very little to do with it, except in Mali, most of the cattle herders are Fulani, the agriculturalists are not Fulani. So it goes that way, and all this was part of what caused the movement of piracy and violence in the Gulf of Guinea, beginning in the 1970s, all the way to recently. So sometimes when you hear that they are just violent and this or that, the Niger Delta and so on, it is there. And finally, there is the land grab phenomenon. In Benin, while I was doing research, I saw communities on the coastal region where most of the arable land is. Land in Africa and in many of our so-called indigenous societies is not just a piece of real estate. It's part of individual, familial, communal identity. And when that is taken, it destroys society. So Chinese, Indians, and others would come to Benin, use government, not appointed, but designated behind closed doors as agents of international trade that would lease properties, land, to Chinese farmers for 99 years. So 99 years in history is beyond 3 generations, because a generation is 30 years. So who will be alive when that happens? It's going to be mostly non-Beninians, non-Africans, and Occupy, you get the right. Thank you very much. And now we're going to open the panel to the Q&A, and we have about 10 minutes for questions and answers. Yes.
My name is Diego. I'm an African Studies and Cultural Science major. And my question is to Dr. and also Dr. So specifically stated that the context of having policy and economies for industrialization. So my question is for other countries in the East, like Somalia, who are missing the rights to China, or Ethiopia and Egypt, who are protesting over the right to denial. How does this affect their development?
I can start. So I think an important development has been the African free trade. Oh,
Would you mind repeating the question for folks who are over
okay.
Can you? No, we don't have
So just project. I think the question was essentially how does the essentially granting of concessions and other rights to other countries along African coastal areas, both in Kenya, Somalia, elsewhere, undermine the future of the development of the blue economy if they don't even have access to their own coastlines and marine spaces. All right.
So an interesting and I think important development has been the African free trade area, because there is an integrated maritime strategy that's a part of that framework. So a lot of times when we think of trade, we just think of overland networks. We think of various trade barriers, the legal barriers within Africa, which I think we have studied quite a bit in terms of how legal frameworks can really hinder cross-border trade. But there's also this coordinated maritime strategy that runs parallel to the overland free trade area. So leadership is talking about it. I'm not quite sure on a state level if, I know Somalia is an interesting case, so I'm not quite sure how the Somali government is integrating their local development plans with the maritime strategy. Maybe Dr. Raleigh knows a little bit more about that. But the conversations are happening, which I think is very important, on a continental level. And it's not necessarily external partners doing it. Even though the United Nations has their framework, they're having these conversations and within the East African community, within the African Union. Implementation is another thing. So you can have a framework, but unless governments integrate it in a real way within their own developmental policies and implement it, it's just going to be, on paper. That's why with this case it's really important, because it's local communities telling the Kenyan government, you have these laws on the books. You have to follow the laws that you have put in place for sustainable development. So without the external pressure of grassroots organizations, but also local governments, pressuring the government, holding them accountable, the laws will just stay there and collect dust. So it's living, it's active, and people are engaged in really innovative ways on social media, street protests, using legal frameworks, using electoral politics. So it's a multi-pronged approach, and for me it's very exciting. So that's why I'm curious to know some of the suggestions you have.
Okay. Well, I'll give you my third suggestion, and I'll frame it in that for about the last 15 years, we've had so many conversations about piracy in Africa in particular, but around the world, and in almost every single one, somebody has brought up the notion of sea blindness, noting that we have perhaps been so focused on lives on land that we've become blind to what's happening at sea and how much the sea impacts our lives. And so we've often used different statistics to say we need to pay attention to the water. 70% of the Earth is covered in water, 80% of the world's population live within 100 miles of the coast, 90% of world trade happens by sea, about 99% now of communication, be it internet or telephonic, goes through submarine cables. And so all of these things are trying to overcome sea blindness. But in that context, we haven't quite gotten to the point of what I have termed maritime wealth blindness. So when we start talking about IUU fishing and coastal development, we have to look at how, okay, maybe piracy has actually opened our eyes to the importance of maritime trade. Maritime trade isn't inherently the blue economy, and it isn't inherently an indicator of how much wealth and value is held in the waters. And so how I describe wealth blindness is if I gave you a bucket of gold and I said, you can't wait, you can't look up the price, go sell it and get the best price you can. You come back and you say, I got $100,000 for that bucket of gold. I say, wow, that's great, keep it, wonderful, you've done well, except it was worth $1 million. And because you didn't know how much you had, didn't know how much it was worth, you just sold yourself 90% short. And to give a concrete example of that, in Sierra Leone, an American marine biologist called a diving center in Sierra Leone and said, hey, can you go down and look and see if you have these little worms? And they went down, they looked, took a picture of them and sent it back and said, yeah, we got them. Marine biologist said, great, thanks. That was it. It was a research project. They just wanted to confirm that the water flow did have the presence of what turned out to be very valuable sea cucumbers. A Chinese broker got wind of this and went to them and said, hey, I'll make you a business proposition. I'll give you $1 for each of those little worms you can bring up. There are tons of them. So for a while, they started bringing them up. And years back, I was involved with helping Sierra Leone develop a national maritime strategy. And in the process of doing that, we discovered this situation and had to let the guys know that they'd been getting $1 a piece for these, that they were worth between $140 and $250 each. So talk about a difference of 90% between $100,000 and $1 million versus $1 to $250. They were getting sold massively short. And so wealth blindness is partly not knowing the value of what you have. The other is not knowing how to develop it. And the blue economy isn't just about harnessing the riches. It's about the inclusive, sustainable, environmentally friendly, and also creative use of the marine space. And Kenya is a great example of this, where particularly in women in the maritime sector initiatives, we've seen incredible development in things like harnessing seaweed and turning it into all kinds of products, in interesting cooperative schemes for restoration in order to do tourism, all kinds of interesting things that bring people into it. And that second one is more like if I handed you a bucket of clay and said, go sell it, get the best price you can, you come back and say, I got $100. You say, well, it was only worth 50, so good job. But don't you have a friend who's a potter? Don't you have a friend who's a sculptor? Couldn't you have turned that into $1,000 or $10,000? And so how do we add value to what it is that we have? And so the blue economy hasn't yet caught it's caught the attention in the sense of dollar signs. It hasn't caught the attention of the political classes in understanding how much value there could be. And so they're unfortunately mortgaging the future of a lot of the countries on a quick buck that seems to be worth a lot of money, but isn't worth even a fraction of what they could have. And so part of what we need to do is make sure that the people who know the value of the marine space the best aren't the ones who want to do it harm, because currently that is the case. It's criminals and it's nefarious state actors, and we have to change that. And so part of the answer to that, sorry for the long-winded answer, but part of the answer to that is that unfortunately there are some really bad deals being made. Sierra Leone just made a terrible deal because they didn't understand the value of the area that they had, or they saw immediate riches and didn't go there. But we also have to recognize that some of these deals are the only deals being put on the table. And so you have to be a little bit sensitive to the fact that some of these states are looking at how to feed themselves and their families, and the next meal isn't coming unless they make a deal. And if there's only one deal on the table, that's the deal they're going to take. And we have to be sympathetic to that. So yes, it's a challenge. We could go into Somalia more, but I think I've said enough. So I'm happy to talk more after.
All right, thank you very much. Somebody else had? Yes, sir.
Can you elaborate on the type of deals Sierra Leone made?
Sierra Leone, just offered up an area to be a Chinese fisheries port. The problem with any of the deals with China involve exclusivity. So they bring in their own workers, they prioritize their own companies, and basically it becomes almost Chinese sovereign territory versus still being useful for the state. And so that's one of many examples. The quintessential example of the Chinese danger in terms of any kind of maritime investment is Sri Lanka, where the forfeiture on the loan to build the port led to China basically owning the main port of southern Sri Lanka. And you look at Djibouti, you look at Kenya, you look at Sierra Leone, you look at almost anywhere on the continent, and you see a Chinese effort to develop port facilities. Part of that is having exclusive access. Part of it is having the ability to obscure some of the things that Dr. Kumar mentioned, because if you are working to take out wildlife, timber, gold, bauxite, tantalum, anything else, you want to be able to do it without having anybody interfering. And if they own the facility, they can do that in obscurity. So China is not quite co-equal with some of the other players in terms of its motivations, but they're also not co-equal in terms of how much they exclude everyone else from whatever investment project they put in.
So are you referring to the Black Johnson Beach deal in Senegal?
Yeah.
Okay.
Any other questions? Yes.
My name is Matthew. I'm a freshman biology major in chemistry minor in Johnson, New York. This question is open to anybody on the panel, but basically says, what are ways that we as college students from various interdisciplinary studies can raise awareness about environmental sustainability and sustainable development in order to be active on the forefront of change in the future?
Since it was one of my suggestions to use voice, I will just say this. You are coming up at a time when the world is full of opportunities for projecting your voice. There are platforms that didn't exist 20 years ago. There are ways of speaking up. The danger of that is that the noise gets very overwhelming, and there's a lack of rigor in a lot of the things being said. There's also a disconnect sometimes between voices that are being become the loudest and those who they're supposed to be helping. And so I would say that there's a mix of a need for rigor in understanding some of these issues, but also a need for relationships. And so rigor and relationships have to be the starting point for then using your voice to advocate. And I think convening authorities was the other thing I mentioned. And what we have now are so many different fora for bringing people together. And one of the things that the U.S. has accidentally done very well in the Gulf of Guinea, wasn't intentional, but it worked, was by not having an understanding of the region and not having enough people to put into the region to build capacity. We've actually started to harness the expertise of African maritime experts, fisheries, naval, port, and so we've actually emboldened some of the people who didn't have a voice even in their own countries. So they now have visibility to their own leadership being used by other states of the region as the go-to experts. And so sometimes using convening authority to highlight others' expertise is much more important than even sharing your own.
I'm going to actually ask Dr. Winstead to talk a little bit about going abroad. Actually, go to some of the coastal countries that we've been talking about. So there are 2 trips to Kenya this summer that Howard University faculty are initiating. There's another one in South Africa. During these trips, meetings can be coordinated. I've done it myself with activists on the ground working on similar issues. Because there's an environmental justice movement here, right, in the United States. And I think it's very important to understand that the issues related to climate change, global warming, environmental justice aren't just impacting people on the other side of the world, they're impacting us in very particular ways. And we play a role, living in the West, a very particular role in holding our government and companies accountable who are engaged in illicit financial flows. We have very rigorous laws on the books here that help ensure that companies don't exploit weak legal frameworks in Africa. So even here, being located in Washington, D.C., Dr. Winstead had one of the major coalitions students that you cited on your slides that actually works in that space here in the United States. So knowing in DC who's working in the space, going abroad, and trying to make these transnational connections, I think is very important. But because you work for the Center for African Studies, you know about all the opportunities for students to get to Africa.
Well, I don't know about all the opportunities,
Okay.
but I do want to introduce Dr. Johnson. She's trying to hide over there. Dr. Johnson is the director for the Center for African Studies, and Dr. Johnson is an advocate promoter of going overseas, and the center is doing everything we can to send as many students as we can to Africa. As many students as we can. Some of you are on my mailing list. Getting a flask, you need to respond. You need to take every opportunity. I'll give you my personal story very quick. I'm here because I went overseas. I studied African studies because I took a trip and went there, and I realized I didn't know Africa. It was not the Africa I knew. So let me just say quickly, understand the problem, go overseas. When you go overseas, realize you are coming with an American bias. Understand and be prepared to really get a picture from the African perspective. You will not get the full picture here in class. Here in class is important, but you've got to get there, and you've got to be willing to engage the people there and to open your mind to those solutions. But you've got to get there. So all of you, get there, open your mind, bring the resources with you.
And I'll just add to that, I used to teach a class called Applied Anthropology, and in that class I really advocated for students at an undergraduate level to go to Africa and to establish relationships with peers. Because there's many, a lot of people don't know that at the high school level and the lower undergraduate levels, there are people in the United States who are forming nonprofits. It could be as small as I just adopt a student who wants to go to school, or work in a farm in Africa over my alternative spring break, or during the summer. One of my undergraduate students who formally graduated, got a Fulbright at the undergraduate level and went to Africa, and now has his PhD and is a professor. So it starts now. Don't wait until graduate classes or your career to get interested in Africa. There's a lot of experiences and a lot of open doors that can get you over there. And just like Dr. Wheeler said, Dr. Plummer, I first got interested in Africa when I was an undergrad. I spent a semester abroad in Africa. So that's really, it started a lifelong career. And so that's how I began started.
Thank you. Well, I'm from Africa, so in addition to what my colleagues just said, which is very important, I also would like to call your attention on something that there are African youth organizations in the United States, almost in every state, and these are just like you, very active, they want to make a difference. So I would recommend that you get in touch with those organizations here. They know Africa, they know the United States, so they can help you navigate. Even if before you are able to go to Africa, you can still start making major changes here by inspiring them, learning from them, and working with them. And another thing that your generation masters that mine is still struggling with is social media, is technology. You can communicate with young Africans on the continent through all the social media platforms, and with the Black Lives Matter movement that started here. You would be surprised to know that resonated in Africa, not just in big cities like Johannesburg or Pretoria, Nairobi, Dakar, and so on, but in some smaller towns. When I was in West Africa this summer, and I went beyond the capital cities and things like that, And people were asking me these questions and showing me on their tablets, their cell phones, things that I'm here in Washington, D.C. that I didn't know about. And they were teaching me about these things. So that kind of connection would still help our students, our young people here in the United States. And finally, we should also aspire to create interconnections, let's say, between Howard University and universities and colleges in Africa, and attract young people, undergraduate, graduates, college, high school, and so on. So it's an excellent question, and you know, we are here to help guide you and your friends. Any other questions? Okay. All right, thank you very much.
Before we break, our Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for the State Department is walking in just a bit, so if you would like to hear first before we break, and then perhaps we could
And move on to the next
panel,
Yeah.
because her voice is going to be on Monday.
Oh, okay, so we wait here.
If you don't mind, she'll be right in.
Okay.
About 5 minutes.
Okay.
For the website.
We have a few other panelists, but we also have
Dr. Heiner.
special guests.
Bring your computer.
And ask them to sing about the State Department. Sorry? Yes. So if everyone can take your seats, please silence your cell phones and anything.
Hello, everyone. My name is Gayina Davila. I am the Policy Coordinator for Africa in OES at the State Department. And OES stands for our Bureau of Oceans and International Environmental and Scientific Affairs. It's a mouthful, but it is exciting. I have the great privilege today of introducing you all to our Deputy Assistant Secretary, Ms. Maxine Burkett. I'm going to read her bio so you all know the great work that she has done, and just prepare yourselves for the great work that she has delivered today. So I should start by saying that our Deputy Assistant Secretary for Oceans, Fisheries, and Polar Affairs, she is in fact a professor, and so I'm quite happy to know that we are mixing with lots of academics in this space today. And so Professor Maxine Burkett serves as the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Oceans, Fisheries, and Polar Affairs in the Department of State's Bureau of Oceans and International Environmental and Scientific Affairs, where she oversees the formulation and implementation of U.S. policy on a broad range of international issues concerning the oceans, the Arctic, the Antarctic, and marine conservation. Previously, Burkett served as an expert senior advisor to Special Presidential Envoy for Climate, John Kerry, where her portfolio included climate-related migration, climate security, bilateral relationships with island nations, and indigenous peoples engagement. A professor of law, Burkett was on the faculties of the University of Hawaii's William S. Richardson School of Law and Colorado Law, where she has taught climate law and ocean and coastal law, and is a visiting professor at Harvard Medical School's Department of Global Health and Social Medicine. Burkett has served on numerous state and federal committees, including the Federal Advisory Committee for the Sustained National Climate Assessment and the Independent Advisory Committee on Applied Climate Assessment, convened by the State of New York and Columbia University. Professor Burkett was a global fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and was a co-founder and senior advisor at the Nonprofit Institute for Climate and Peace. She is a member she is a member scholar at the American Law Institute and the International Associations Committee on International Law and Sea Level Rise, for which she served as a co-rapporteur from 2019 to 2021. Burkett received her BA from Williams College, which awarded her the Bicentennial Medal for Distinguished Achievement in 2016, and Exeter College, Oxford University. She received her JD from Berkeley Law, University of California, and served as a law clerk for the Honorable Susan Ilsen of the United States District Court, Northern District of California. It is my pleasure to introduce you to our DAS, Maxine Burkett.
It's really a pleasure to be here. All right, thank you so much. Good afternoon. It's really a pleasure to be with you all today. And to Professor Hailu and to the entire leadership of Howard University, particularly the African Studies Department, the Africa Center at Howard University, and the Environmental Law Program, the Environmental Program, and the Department of Interdisciplinary Studies. Thank you for hosting us today. Let me start by saying, and this is not hyperbole, Africa will shape the future. And not just the future of the African people, but of the world. As one of the largest free trade areas, fastest growing populations, most diverse ecosystems, and one of the largest regional voting blocs in the United Nations, it's impossible to meet this era's defining challenges without Africa's contributions and leadership. By the middle of the century, 1 in 4 people in the world will be African. In short, what happens in Africa impacts the entire world. These are just a few of the reasons why today's event is not only important, but essential as the United States continues to deepen our engagement and partnerships in Africa. It's fitting that this symposium focused on understanding the opportunities and threats in sub-Saharan Africa's coastal and land resources is being held at Howard University, a culturally diverse, research-intensive, and historically Black university that's tackling some of the most vexing challenges of our time. In our efforts to meet this generation's challenges, the Biden-Harris administration has placed a strong emphasis on the U.S. sub-Saharan strategy that reflects the region's complexity, its diversity, its power, and its influence. A strategy that focuses on what we will do with African nations and peoples. Put simply, the United States and sub-Saharan African nations can't achieve any of our shared priorities, whether it's continuing the recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic, creating broad-based economic opportunity, addressing the climate crisis, putting an end to illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing, or expanding energy access. We can't achieve any of these critical goals if we don't work together as equal partners. In that spirit, I will focus on IUU fishing, which is a critical issue for African nations, as well as nations all over the world. And we know that no one country can solve it by itself. We must work together as equal partners to ensure that healthy fisheries and ocean ecosystems will be there for the future. So global losses due to IUU fishing are estimated to be between US $10 and $23 billion annually, with almost $1 billion from sub-Saharan Africa. IUU fishing is a key contributor to more than 90% of global fishery stocks being fully exploited, overexploited, or depleted, impacting regions that are also most affected by climate change. This practice also accounts for 1/5 of the global fisheries catches, worth up to $23.5 billion annually, the third most lucrative natural resource crime after timber and mining. In West Africa alone, about 7 million people depend directly on fishing as a source of income. Let's think about that for a minute. 7 million people. Yet this income is increasingly hindered by illegal fishing. IUU fishing threatens the livelihoods of the coastal communities that rely on sustainable fish stocks for income and food security, and it creates market distortions that put fishers who abide by fisheries rules at a disadvantage. The United States is working domestically and multilaterally to strengthen the rules governing international fisheries and engaging bilaterally with the world's flag, coastal, port, and market states to promote accountability, responsibility, and having all of that be according to international standards. For example, the Maritime Security and Fisheries Enforcement, or MSAFE Act, passed in December 2019, mobilizes a coordinated whole government approach to globally counter IUU fishing and related threats to maritime security. As both a major harvester and top market for fisheries products, the United States has long emphasized working with other countries, including our sub-Saharan African partners, to improve fisheries governance and enforcement to prevent IUU-sourced fish products from entering the U.S. market. The United States is also focused on sustainable fisheries, looking at how fish contribute to food security, the importance of taking labor conditions into consideration in the fisheries value chain, and how to use new technologies like artificial intelligence to combat IUU fishing. For example, in Ghana, we supported the Future Ghana Fisheries Recovery Act, an $18 million 5-year program to mitigate the near collapse of Ghana's small oceanic species and to establish a sustainable basis for their recovery. The $26 million USAID Sustainable Fisheries Management Project is another example of close cooperation between the United States and our sub-Saharan African partners. This project improved coastal fisheries management, including creating Ghana's first closed season fishing. We don't just see shared challenges, but also shared opportunities. Putting an end to IUU fishing and developing sustainable blue economies that are climate and nature positive, that offers great promise for coastal nations across a range of economic sectors. With careful stewardship, we can ensure that ocean continues to benefit future generations, both in sub-Saharan Africa and the United States. In closing, I want to underscore that the entire U.S. government, with strong support from the White House, is eager to deepen our engagement with our partners on the continent to advance maritime security, economic, and environmental interests that our countries share. It's my hope that your time here today will facilitate constructive and fruitful dialogue on how we can better leverage the opportunities faced by sub-Saharan African nations while effectively addressing the threats presented in both coastal and land resources. Thank you for your time.
I want to invite the rest of the okay, all of my panelists are here, but invite the rest of our panelists to the front. So welcome everyone to the second panel for this symposium. This panel is titled Addressing the Challenges of Africa's Environmental Stability and Sustainable Development. My name is Krista Johnson. I'm Director of our Center for African Studies and an Associate Professor in the Department of African Studies. And we have four panelists here at the moment. Who are we missing? Oh, Krista, is Dr. Thomas not coming? Yes? No, okay. So we will have 4 panelists today. Good, because I was going to keep you all on a very strict time break, and now maybe I'll give you a few more minutes. So we have 4 panelists today, so that's good, because I was going to give you all just 10 minutes, because I'd like to have a robust discussion. But now you can go 12 minutes, 13, and then I'll start cutting people off. So we have 4 panelists for you today. I think we'll just go in the order of the schedule, and so then I'll invite Dr. Almaz Zodi to come forward first and give her presentation on global responses to the threats of environmental degradation to Africa's land and oceans.
Thank you, Dr. Johnson, and I thank the organizers of this symposium because it's a very, very important symposium. I did my little research, not knowing exactly what would be said, but after this morning, most of what I thought should be highlighted before we go to solutions was really covered, with one little exception that I would like to add to the conversation, and that is really the least dangerous looking thing that we call land grab. That process happens not to be just about claiming African land and using it for external purposes, but also the side effects of that, which is the complete destruction of the ecosystem and biodiversity and the quality of the soil. Because after they introduce this monocropping, which is relatively inimical to African systems, African climatic regions, they practically leave the land unusable. So one of our dissertation students about 5 years ago developed a thesis that the foreignization of land actually has so many side effects not recognized by anybody. And it destroys the whole livelihoods of entire communities, entire regions. So, and Dr. Kamara discussed extensively that there are two major sources that impact African environments, African ecologies, and those are deforestation, that we covered, I think, quite extensively, and I won't have to say anything. And the other is really toxic and non-toxic dumping in Africa. So the toxic thing goes anywhere from, e-products that are dumped in Africa to hazardous waste, and also non-hazardous solid waste that are dumped through government agreements for the least amount of income that they can get, because it will take a lot more to recycle it in the developed countries that generate those waste. So they dump it in Africa for a minimum cost. So Africa gets to ruin its environment and gets very little for it. And that is universal. Europe does it, not so much America. Europe is very close to Africa. So Italy and France and England and all of those people dump in Africa. Much more in West Africa than in East Africa, for some. South Africa has not been mentioned. South Africa is very notorious for allowing even illegal dumping. How does that happen? I think a number of people told you about the major problem that Africa faces, and that is unaccountable political elites who can really bypass laws to allow certain things that are not in the interest of Africa. So it shows you that the participation of people that Dr. Plummer mentioned, communities organizing, unfortunately, after the fact, to redeem whatever is happening to the living environments. If these consultations had taken place prior to the implementation of the projects, the outcomes for Africa would be very different. So this idea of transnational economies being the norm is really one of the things that is destroying the African prospects. We can think of some solutions, but not today. So what has the international community done about saving global environments, but that includes Africa? There is one thing that is very unique to Africa, an international convention, the Bamako Convention of 1998, that focused on Africa and the prohibition of any foreign entity dumping anything on the African continent for any reason at all. You wouldn't know that the Bamako Convention existed if you see what is happening in Africa today. So, in general, I'll finish before you signal me, I'm sure. In general, there are more than 21 international conventions, including protecting the ozone layer of the atmosphere. We didn't know that the hairspray we were using was actually destroying the ozone. You young people would know, you've never seen it. But when we were young, we used those things and nobody considered them dangerous. And apparently they were. So international conventions just deal with them, about 22 of them. But two are critical, it seems to me. And the one is the United Nations framework agreement that really laid out what every nation should do to protect the environment. And that, of course, includes Africa. The United Nations was a very good institution back in those days. So it really, in the beginning, sought to prohibit any trans-border transportation of harmful or hazardous materials to be dumped into another country. So if you produce it, you have to be responsible for it. But there was a lot of objection to that by very powerful countries, and so that law was relaxed to allow a certain amount of dumping with the agreement of concerned governments. But of course, before you know it, in this day and age, it's not only governments who can control, allow, or prohibit dumping, but there are, as mentioned by a few of the researchers that presented today, illegal groupings across the world who attack Africa for its resources, whether it is fisheries, whether it is forest products like rosewood, for instance, a very precious wood that takes a very long time to grow. It's being decimated. And 96% of Ghana's produce of rosewood goes to China. But everybody, participates in depleting the African, natural environment. The net effect is that African climate is changing for no reason that Africa produces. None, because Africa produces very little waste of any kind. It doesn't even produce things that attack or produce carbon dioxide. Quite the opposite. It used to have lots of trees that were the lungs, considered the lungs of the world, next to the Amazon. But that is disappearing with about 4 million hectares of forest being cut every year. And only 24% of African land mass is devoted to forest. So very dangerous thing. These conventions, as good as they were, the Bamako or the framework conventions, which I think were the two key ones for Africa, even if they operated, they would not have saved it because the actors are a very complex set of people. Then we don't live in a world that was similar to the world that the conventions were designed to address, because nations were supposed to implement them. And as we said this morning, everybody presented African nations for many reasons are in no position to protect their environment, even if there are UN conventions focused on Africa or other things. So these are really the things we have to talk about solutions. But I have my own ideas on those, but I don't think today is the time. If during question and answer time you have questions, then we can throw around some ideas. I'll be able to say something about that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Zodi. Next, we have Dr. Janelle Burke, who is Director of our Interdisciplinary Environmental Studies Program here at Howard University. Her presentation will be on youth engagement through educational exchange, impacts from a collaboration between Howard University and the South African Institute of International Affairs.
everyone. Thank you for having me. I'm very impressed with the expertise in this room for sure, hearing about the threats to fisheries in sub-Saharan Africa. And today I'd like to speak about some of the opportunities. So my role here at Howard University, I'm the director of our interdisciplinary environmental studies program. Relatively new program, it's been around since 2017. And we were able to build a curriculum under the framework of environmental inequality, rigorous environmental science, and also policy. So our students are trained, our undergraduate students are trained in these interdisciplinary areas to tackle solutions. So today I want to speak about one partnership I had the pleasure to be involved with, which was last year. It terminated last year. And this was a youth exchange program between South African students and Howard students. And when I think a lot about curriculum development and interdisciplinary studies and environmental science, I think about what are the solutions. What do we need in the curriculum? What do we need to do to be innovative, right? We need the didactic courses, we need the core content, but we also need transferable skills. We need tech transfer, we need innovation. And one thing that was really innovative about this particular program was that it involved youth from South Africa, youth advocates, youth activists, and then also community-driven students from Howard University. So this program was awarded to SIA, which is the South African Institute for International Affairs, in 2019 through the State Department. And it began with virtual exchange. Virtual exchange and meetings of students, both from Cape Town, South Africa, and surrounding areas, and also students at Howard University. And the goal was to work towards community engagement plans. Community engagement around a particular idea or particular issue that the students chose. And it was an amazing opportunity because then in 2020, the plan was the 20 students from South Africa would travel to Howard, and the 20 Howard students would travel to South Africa. But instead, with the pandemic, we had to pivot, and that ended up being a longer program with more virtual engagement. And because here at Howard, we all switched to virtual courses, that opened the doors to South African participants into our courses. So students participated in sustainable fashion. I had a lecture on agriculture, sustainable agriculture, for example, and the students got to participate and ask questions. And then the same thing on the Howard side, the students were able to participate in lectures on community advocacy from the youth themselves about their experiences in South Africa. In 2022, we were able to continue the program and have physical exchange, have some students come to Howard and a few students go to Cape Town. And our kickoff event was last year, very similar time, also helped sponsored by the Bunch Center, where we had youth activists speak about their experiences and how it's important to have community organization and advocacy around environmental issues. So that's the first flyer you see there. And here in the second picture is our plant curator, Ronald Swanson, here at Howard University, giving a tour of the greenhouse as a way to focus on research for environmental issues, plant research, sustainable agriculture, but then also for, in particular, growing food for the communities as well on a university campus. The picture here on your left is a community solar farm. This is the largest community solar farm in Washington, D.C. It's in Southeast D.C. It's run by DOEE, the District Office of Energy and Environment. And neighbors and folks who opt into this community solar get to have the credits back on their account. So it's managed by the district, but the benefits go to the local community. And we had a really engaging conversation about what that process was like. How do you have buy-in from the local community about a solar farm? How do you educate about the benefits and what this may be, and potential threats as well. And then we got to take students to Howard University to see in particular our green roof above the A building, which a lot of people don't get to see, our sustainability strategies here at home. Here's some of the solar panels also on top of the administrative building here at Howard University to see how we're invested in sustainability as well. And to look at some of the issues in the technology transfer and the costs involved in making these just transitions. And then in addition, there's educational activities as well. So in particular, looking at local food sources and looking at grains and varieties that are native to Africa as food
to come and give his presentation on the future of fisheries in Southern Africa, challenges and opportunities.
Thank you. Thank you, Prof. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, especially to students for coming here. So please let me know about the time. Right? I'm going to have, because many of my classes that I teach in undergraduate class, African Studies 101. Many of the students are here. Welcome. It's good to see you here. This is a class that kind of assumes a tabula rasa on the students about the content. So in my intervention today, I will try to cater as well to not leave any student behind and kind of give us the lay of the land, or Professor Joke alert here, lay of the sea, right? So there's Professor Joke, only professors laugh. If the assistant deputy secretary will say she would laugh. She's a professor. It's okay, students, you are forgiven. But it goes without saying, though, that the fisheries are an important domain in Southern Africa, because I'll specialize here and take a regionalist approach. Not only do they sustain livelihoods for people, and these are not abstract things, these are people's lives, right? In coastal countries, let's look. Coastal countries, Southern Africa, Mozambique, South Africa, Namibia. So again, students taking a mental note here. So not only is it important for these coastal countries, it's also important for a few of these landlocked countries, Lesotho, Eswatini, Botswana, Zambia, Malawi, amongst others. Right? So since it's not an abstract thing, and it's about human beings, not only in the countries involved in the coastline, we must still, though, appreciate the scale using the coastline. So let's appreciate the scale of the challenges, which I'm talking about, and the opportunities. And don't worry, I only talk about 2 opportunities and 2 challenges. Right? So let's look at Mozambique's coastline, 1,430 miles. Let's look at South Africa's coastline, 1,739 miles. Let's look at Namibia's coastline, 977 miles. So that very important strategic part of the African continent. All these economies, some of you have eaten Chilean sea bass, right? Your parents during their anniversary have eaten a Chilean sea bass. Well, it's because this country has a very vibrant and robust fisheries economy. Well, this perspective then, to look at fisheries and the challenges and the opportunities, is important to look at them from a regional perspective for 3 reasons. One, it helps us to appreciate from kind of a global vantage point, our vantage point, even as students here in the United States, what is at stake and the scale of the vast opportunities therein. There's a lot to talk about here. It's an area the size of India, so to speak. Second, this regionalist approach also helps us to kind of see the challenges in a way that is very important, measurable, because we're dealing with one specific, and replicable, to be able then to extract certain generalizable lessons learned, best practices, and be able to apply it to other less developed coastlines that may have similar problems. So it is reductionist. And third, this regionalist approach, I would say, to the question of the future of fisheries on the African continent, it is important because it helps us deal with the environmental blowback of fisheries, of fishing and overfishing in a specific region with possible implications for the rest of the continent. So, how about opportunities? Well, according to the Africa program of the World Bank, well, let's pause right here and appreciate the times we live in. The World Bank, that big institution of development that some of you students will work for or intern in, stay here in Washington, a blessing of being in this area. It has an Africa fisheries program. So that means the fact that it is a desk on fisheries, it shows how much, how the importance that they attach to this problem exactly and the opportunities therein. Let's look. Approximately 24 billion of the African continent or continent's economy would be fisheries. That's 1.3% of the total GDP. Okay. Let's look at one country that's important in this region of Southern Africa. South Africa itself, my home, the country of my birth. South Africa fisheries economy is 33 million per year, which might look like a minuscule number or prima facie, but upon closer examination, we find that this is 5% of the entire fisheries of the African continent. So the challenges of South Africa, and by extension the Southern African region that basically, can be extrapolated easily in order to find or to make certain conclusions with other countries further up on the African continent. So we must be concerned with first best practices. There could be region-to-region agreements on best practices and implementable regimes on fisheries. Africans are always talking about kind of a united effort on things. Here is one area that is not abstract, that directly impacts human livelihoods, especially the lives of essentially women, chief economists in many African economies. And so it is, I argue, a strategic concern for all involved. Many minutes.
No, you're doing well. You've got 7 minutes.
Okay. There could be, secondly, there should be a regional, if not continental, negotiation regime. This is with important trade partners like the EU and China to kind of establish a set of standards. Why? Because in many African countries, unfortunately, even Africans don't like talking about this, there are huge gaps, what some people call competency gaps, some people call capacity gaps. So just because a country has a capacity gap, a country like, for example, let's name it Malawi, does not mean that it should be deprived of participating in a regime that would help it when negotiating with a behemoth like China, right? So in other words then, by having a regionalist approach on regimes and set of standards and best practices, the region is able to act like a country, at least when it comes to this all-important area of fisheries. And I argue it must, because it is not an abstract and it has something to do with people's lives and livelihoods. Okay, the two challenges then, like other natural resources, I argue, the fisheries and all natural endowments associated with it, so whether you talk of aquaculture, even in a landlocked country, can be a resource curse rather than a blessing for the region. It could contribute to those old but not so inaccurate sometimes characterizations of some parts of Africa. In other words, in Africa, there sometimes needs hand-holding when it comes to important things. So if this is not handled well and delicately and strategically as it should be handled, then this would result. So a challenge then, one, is instability in the region. So this is a challenge in the region with which I'm concerned. The conflict in Mozambique, essentially, that still rages on and shows no sign of abating, regardless of a concerted effort by the region to stave off more violence, is a concern. It's not only a concern for Mozambique, hopefully with the picture that I've painted, it's a concern for Mozambique, the entire coastline, and the economies that are concerned with it, because Mozambique is such a big part of the coastline of the region. Second, unfortunately, might sound like a cliche, but corruption. Fishing rights and the issuance of concessions, fishing concessions to big Chinese companies and others must be a process that must be transparent. So I'm not only showing a challenge, I'm showing a possible solution, right? So that we are not accused that, oh no, you are being Afro-pessimist. You're only showing the problem. So here is a problem, here is a solution, right? So what's the solution? Documents to these negotiations could be made, could be put on the internet, right? Be made, in other words, democratize the access to this information for all people concerned. That will basically get rid of, it will give disincentives to bad actors, okay? Whereas, last point then on these challenges and how to overcome them, solutions, there is this idea, names mean a lot, because names attach the importance. Just like your professor, if you're an English 101 said, I should know what you're going to write about in the first sentences of what you're saying, a thesis statement. So names of ministries, they denote priorities, they denote sometimes objectives, and they denote structural priorities for the country concerned. So let's look then at these 3 countries with coastlines in Southern Africa, at the names they give to ministries concerned with fisheries, right? So in South Africa, they did not have a ministry with the name fisheries in its name for a while. In 1994, fisheries fell under, and remember I've said this is a strategic thing, it's very important, it has something to do with people's lives directly. So water affairs and forestry, that was the name given. And this changed in 2009, it was now called Water and Environmental Affairs. Some might say still kind of nebulous if you want to attach more attention, especially attention to solve problems. Then recently, as in 2019, South Africa has the Ministry of Environment, Forestry and Fisheries. But let's look at Mozambique. Mozambique has a Minister of Sea, Inland Waters and Fisheries. How about Namibia? Namibia is winning, I would say. It is a Minister of Fisheries and Marine Resources. So Namibia has its game in order, I would say. In other words, if names denote anything and objectives and so on and so forth, Namibia is winning. So South Africa needs to get with the problem, because if South Africa doesn't get with the problem, the region doesn't get with the problem when it comes to the importance of these things. However, South Africa is not alone for South African students here start being mad. The AU itself is still convoluted on the issue of fisheries. The AU has a series of committees, I think about 8 or 9, on whatever priorities, peace and security, etc., etc. What is the name of the committee dealing with, that would say it deals with fisheries? It's the Committee on Agriculture, Rural Development, Blue Economy, and Sustainable Environment. No fisheries there. Names mean a lot. Names are narrative. Names denote objectives. And in a time when there's been a democratization of the space where information is shared, to not see the name fishery sometimes in a name is actually out of sight, out of mind. So I'll stop there, and thank you for the opportunity.
Wonderful. I'm so pleased for sticking to time. I'm going to call on our last panelist to comment. In his paper, Professor Alan Hailu, who will present on Africa's environmental health and sustainable development as key to world security, understanding the spatial and socio-ecological interconnections across land, water, and sea.
Thank you, Dr. Johnson, and thank you for coming. My title is Africa's Environmental Health and Sustainable Development as Key Toward Security. Subtitle: Understanding the Spatial and Socio-Ecological Interconnections across land, water, and sea. It touches on many of the great points raised by all the eloquent presenters today. But what my presentation would want to do is emphasize the interconnections, and I used an example of in research class, telling students the importance of defining how the functions capture a small part, capture part, and there they can distort, they can explain, and how we take the choice of taking elements from objects or from what we see. So when we learn, in my class I tell what percentage of the world is land? Less than 30%. 70% is sea, water. That's why don't we call the earth water, it's water. Or sometimes I tease some of the students, what percentage of their body is water? And they say, we don't know, 65%. So why don't we say you water? In fact, I am amused by 19th century example of Bishop Gregory, who was against evolution, and some of his critics were mad. And they said to him, does he know that 65% of himself is water? So this makes us appreciate water as not only a resource, not only, as pointed out by my colleagues, as means of our livelihood. The years ago, when many of you were young, when the internet started, the phrase, the information highway came about, which meant that the internet was a place where exchanges of ideas and information happened. And the seas are sources of information highway, sources of transport, or the major part of global goods and services flow. So you see how these have great value, but sometimes they're buried in how we define them, how we understand them. So it's focused on Africa. So I say Africa's environmental interest as key to world security. We understand how these changes in the world have been made in terms of understanding development. We all, many of you are development students, how development came about to represent economic growth, and the subsequent rethinking showed how that is only a limited aspect, in fact a dangerous aspect of it, unless it's combined with other aspects of what development is supposed to do. Interest in health, interest in the environment, interest in living conditions, in culture, in rights. So we see the sea, the water, the coastal, they are what years ago, there was famine in Africa, the group called its song, We Are the World. So the sea is that's what we are. We are the sea, not only what the sea, but what the sea represents. It connects not only people, not only trade, not only policies, but the very basis of our living. The oxygen we breathe, the materials in the sea, these small objects in the sea that are helpful in medicine, in all aspects of things. So this is a way of trying to show how we overlook interconnection, how we take something and divide them in other parts. And one of the critics of the 18th, 19th, 20th century model of development was this total conception of human beings separate from reality, separate from the physical world, from the waters, from not speak of the fish and all that. Even when you speak of the fish, when you speak of governments talking about the policies, fishery. Fishery is only one aspect of how to get the fish. It should exclude the life system that's there. That's key to our development. That's part of us. That then of course fish as part of the nutrition will be included. So I'll go quickly at many of the points. We see how this is so important for the world and for Africa. Whereas you can see in the PowerPoint, 38 out of the 54 countries have coastal systems, coastal borders. In marine development was recently hailed as a new frontier of African Renaissance by the African Union. I'm sure if you like me, when we were young, we used to watch the space movie, and I remember as a boy being impressed by space, the final frontier. Now, the oceans, the seas, the water systems, the rivers that feed into them, the air, that's the final frontier. There is no dividing one from the other, and we'll see how conceptualizing them and understanding them will lead us into understanding ways of approaching this, addressing this, not for the sake of some big project or aid or interest in a region, but for our own survival. And I'll bring an example later what this means. My colleague, Theo, pointed out the coastal line was stretching from 2,800 kilometers, 1,740 miles, from Mozambique to Namibia. and then you can go all the way up to eastern part of Africa, Western Africa, and for the other parts too. But the downside of this is how even though it's so important, as you point out, as you pointed out, as you can see in the map, all these nations are divided. So when the health of these regions is respected, when the oceans and the rivers are protected, then for one thing, you pointed out, a good number of the population lives on the coastal area. That's the highway for trade, for communications, for many. So this makes us to appreciate. And when we talk about environmental health and sustainability as key, what we're saying is in the past, what I was talking about where the work, about the interconnections, is how reducing what they call reductionism was what led many policies in development, in growth, in trade. And out of that, awareness came in that unless you are interested in the larger picture, you're looking at only one aspect. And the thing I remember from reading about health systems in the West, where you have health systems, educational systems, is where there was a time, 150 years ago, only the rich could afford health, only the rich could afford education. And one of the debates they had at the time was when fever and many diseases, communicable diseases happened in many parts of this country, like in New York. They saw that unless health is extended to ordinary working people, the rich cannot be protected from that, because they come as people who help in the kitchen, as people who help them in ways. So that was why it was made. And now the frontier has expanded. What happens in the remotest part of the world will happen here, as Cyrus pointed out, showed to us, or COVID in one place, a lady flying to Canada could spread it in a matter of time, where 1 million Americans were killed by COVID as well, 2 to 3 years ago. And the health of the Asians, if they can be a cause for medicine, cause for food, cause for protecting the climate, but also the converse is, if they're not protected, if they're not looked at, if they're not taken care of, the health is not maintained, this will happen to other parts of the world. And in the past, nations explained security, defined security, national security. National security meant having thousands of soldiers, weapons, and that the borders are secure. That was security. With globalization, there are no borders, information flows freely, disease flow freely, communications happen freely. So you have to be concerned about the world. Health is no longer protected by keeping the health of New Yorkers or Americans, just for the sake of policymakers. And this is what I think our Symposium is trying to do. As you can see, oh, no, I'm running out of time. Okay. I thought I had lots of time. So I want to emphasize, by way of completing, the need for aligning policies, for aligning ways of understanding is important in making sure that the health of the world, the health of Africa is the health of the United States. And countries like they were to where years ago they were come feeding and things, but not anymore. So, to conclude, there is this quote there is this quote from Diop, Raga Diop. You might check it on the internet. It's one of the beautiful poems, about death and spirituality and nature. And this is what pre-Western, before West was Western, and what many of the third world countries are. How indigenous populations saw themselves as part of nature, as part of the world, as part of the trees. How the small insects and small things were, like in Hindu, in many of the traditional Indian religions, they would sweep the floors, not to kill the ant. And people say this are so stupid. Why should they kill ants? But now we know ants are the base of our that soften the soil. These are the ones. So we're connected with this. We're connected with Africa. And to conclude with my topic, the key, the environmental health of Africa is key to global security, not just in terms of weapons and nuclear things, but the welfare, the conditions, health, economic, and other conditions. And it's important that we become part of this process. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Haile. We have just a few minutes to take a few questions from the audience. I appreciate all of our panelists' thoughts and reflections and ideas. Do we have questions from the audience? Oh, I'm sorry, yes.
And I wanted to pose this to the earlier panel as well. One of the great things about getting to do this program is actually just hearing experts who are really digging into these issues. And I'd love to know, what do you think from where you're sitting, the U.S. government, to policymakers, to actually leverage the opportunities? If there are other, I love it was great to hear that the State Department funded the program that we heard about earlier. But if our panelists, either the ones sitting and of course the ones who were here earlier, if we have anyone still here from earlier, could speak to that. If there's a specific kind of theme that you think, hey, if the U.S. government could just perhaps be better aware of this issue or perhaps better leverage this opportunity, I'd love to hear it.
That's an excellent question. Let me start with our,
Sorry.
Let me start with our panelists here, but I do want to hear also from our
Okay.
other panelists. Does anyone up here want to? Yes. Dr. Zerbe.
If I understand the question correctly, is how can the U.S. help, basically?
That is, yep, that happens. If there's something, yeah.
I think what the U.S. and other developed countries can do to help is to strengthen African governments, to really enable them to control their borders effectively. Because from all the speeches we heard, one of the things is that the countries are not strong enough to enforce. Or there are corrupt officials in there who actually facilitate some of this. So the international community can now get active and help clean these things up and then empower the African governments. Africa is very poor, as you know, for no fault of its own, by the way. It is part of the global development system that is in the way of African development. So the U.S. can help very much with that. Thank you.
Let me go to Dr. Kumar. You want to stand up and maybe give us your thoughts?
Sorry to interfere, she
not
said
at all. Yes.
both panels.
Yes.
But more seriously, you heard the young man who was sitting over there and asking how can the students at Howard University and elsewhere get involved in this activism to help with the environmental issues in Africa and elsewhere. I think the State Department and also the Department of Education, but since we are here with the State Department, I think the State Department could connect more closely with these institutions like Howard University here, where Dr. Nyandu and Dr. Winstead talked about study abroad, where they will be taking students, undergraduate students, but also assisted by graduate students to Africa to study languages. We can make those programs more synergistic when we are taking students here to go to South Africa to mostly study Zulu and other languages. We have students from other areas who are interested in studying and promoting environmental sustainability in Southern Africa, in anywhere in Africa, and also connecting them with their peers, African students, African youth organizations. I personally believe that we will win the battle for Africa if we invest in our youth. Africa has, about 60-something% of the African population, 1.4 billion people, are 30 or younger. So if we don't invest in that youth, using the youth we have here, very bright young men and young women, students and young scholars, if we don't invest in these, we're going to be talking to, heads of states who are more interested in having a third term, a fourth term of presidency when the Constitution says only 2. We are talking to people who are more interested in bringing more money in the banks of Switzerland, good luck, and all that. Let's invest in our youth and connect them with Africa.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Any other? You're looking at me as though you want to contribute. No, you're just looking at me. Yes, Jim.
Yes, that's a better question. Yeah, I think investing in grants, educational grants, not just for travel, which we focus on, but visa access and passport access. Passport access for Africans, especially youth, can be prohibitive. The cost of applying, getting that appointment, and the visas themselves. So I think the government, U.S. government, could help facilitate that through educational grants and support.
Thank you. And I would just also add, I think that it's, in some ways the U.S. lost the high ground in terms of really setting international norms and standards and kind of really promoting the rules, right? The kind of the rules system by kind of ceding that to other actors. We really have, I think, an important role to play there in terms of the kind of normative framework, and that requires, I think, this is kind of a vague response, but it requires us to, I think, align our rhetoric, kind of multilateralism, rhetoric with a lot of the engagement that we do on the certainly on the African continent, which oftentimes tends to be more bilateral. So I think that we kind of, and as speaking on what Professor Nyamdu said, names or kind of these things matter, right? So even though you have the language of we're all about kind of multilateralism, but if you're engaging and kind of picking off and kind of prioritizing certain countries, it not only gives a different message, but it incentivizes different actions on the part of African leaders. And if we're looking to develop regional cooperation and regional kind of engagement and problem solving around these issues, it's important that I think the United States can lead with regards to that as well.
And can I just mention that that's precisely what Secretary Boykin has been saying and what we are trying to do at the State Department. And even this event today, thank you Dr. for just being a great partner and working with us, but really going beyond just the bilateral kind of steps here and looking at it regionally and looking at the whole context of how we can better engage, also even domestically to be engaging and trying to kind of really push the conversation forward, especially after the Africa Leaders Summit that we saw happen just in December. And so as far as OAS goes, the State Department goes, we look forward to continuing our partnership with Howard and other minority serving institutions. So thank you so much for the input. Thank you so much to the panelists. We learned quite a lot. So thank you for that.
Excellent. We've come to really the end of our session, but I want to turn it over to Professor Hyland to maybe give final thanks.
I think unless there is some, I want to thank everybody and I want to thank the employees, partners of state, and partners of the organizing committee, and all of you for being here. It's a testament to our awareness and everybody.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you so much for OAS for co-sponsoring this and collaborating with Howard on this. We look forward to future collaborations. And thank you all.